Right, welcome to Week 8 Digital Pedagogies in Secondary Schools. We're looking at collaborative learning, and as you know from the course program, Week 8 has actually been split into 2 weeks. Week 9, collaborative learning is a huge part of our study in this course. And yeah, it actually goes back to Week 6 and 7. You know, remember I did the session on toolishness is foolishness, and the only thing that makes technology work is interaction. Well, collaborative learning is really the house in which interaction lives. It's the core of our practice as teachers. So we're going to get into that now and have a little bit of a look at our topic for the week. And I'm also going to bring along a couple of video friends who are going to talk to you about certain aspects. Russell Stannard is going to talk to you about the flipped classroom. And I also got a young chap called Nathaniel Bott, who's a Year 10 student when he recorded this video for TED down in Tasmania, and he's going to talk about the 21st century classroom. So let's have a look at where we're going. I want to begin by saying that technology is critical, and it's, you know, the teacher having technology skills is vital, because the role of the teacher, you know, really has a major role in shaping the conditions in which students can become engaged and which they learn. And Nathaniel Bott will talk to us about this in some detail, so you know, don't take my word for it. Let's imagine our own students talking back to us here, because in assessment task 2, you actually have to, at the end, in week 10 to 12, you actually have to write a creative account of a student in your own class using technology. So it's pretty good, and it's pretty important, I think, that we hear from Nathaniel. But a couple of things I want to talk about this week. Exploration and discovery, knowledge creation and sharing, collaboration and contribution, and authentic assessment. Now, early in the piece, I raised Betty Collis's contributing student model, and it does all four. It does them beautifully. But what we're talking about here is how you do it as a teacher. Now, in week 6, we asked you to do a map, a curriculum map, a pedagogical map, principally based on the generic capabilities. Now, in there, you actually had to identify low-end pedagogies and high-end pedagogies. Now, it's not hard to identify low-end pedagogies related to literacy, numeracy, ICT, etc. It's not hard. But I've had a few pained responses from people this week saying, how the hell do I develop high-end technologies? Or high-end pedagogies? And again, the answer is, don't panic, SAMR. SAMR, think about the stages: substitution, augmentation, right through to remodifying and repurposing. So when you come up with a low-end literacy pedagogy, think SAMR. What do I have to do to turn into a high-end one? What technology is going to help me remodify this low-end task? And put that in your table. If you can do that, you've got half of your problem solved. But these four things: exploration, discovery, knowledge creation, sharing, collaboration, contribution, and authentic assessment, they all relate to a major shift where we've been based, learning's been based on instructions. Pre-selected study materials has been teacher-centric, it's been drill and practice driven, and now it's moved towards learning activities during which learners can become co-designers from themselves and for others. And that's what assessment task is, assessment task 2. You are co-designing a unit. You are curating artifacts, you are selecting an item from that list of artifacts, and you are developing a unit of study around it. You get to determine how long that unit is. You get to control, you get to throw the furniture around. So it's important now that we create the confidence for you to do that. So the need for network technology and web environments are at the centre of this unit of assessment. And they're also at the core of what you do as a teacher. I noticed Greg Millwood talked about Education Queensland and some of the technology that we're trying to use in this course, and actually not being allowed by Education Queensland, by being banned. So it's we are going to come up with all sorts of issues and all sorts of gatekeeping issues as we go forward as teachers using technology. Remember, toolishness is foolishness. We only use technology that works for us and that adds value to our teaching. Hopefully this presentation will help explain how. Let's begin by the task this week. Here we are, week 8, and I know not many of you are up to this task. I was looking at the blogs, and most of your blogs stop at week 5. Now, this is not blog shame. I don't want you to experience blog shame. No blame. Okay, I know you're busy people. But let's look forward. Let's look forward to week 12. Now, in order to complete week 12 successfully and without pain and gnashing of teeth, that starts now. So the aim was in week 6 that you actually got together your generic map, okay, based on your capabilities. And you actually had slowly over week 7 built that into high-end and low-end pedagogies, and now we're thinking about the sorts of SAMRing. We're SAMRing it to death, where we actually can look at turning those low technologies into high-end pedagogies and the sorts of tools that we might use to do that. So Assessment 2 sends you out free-ranging, and you'll hear more about this today. And we're looking for ideas, resources that are going to suit and support the pedagogy and help us reach the redefinition level of SAMR. So once we've achieved that, we may find these things, teaching ideas, digital tools, they're all going to have to be repurposed. And they'll be repurposed into Assessment Task 2, and they need to be repurposed in a way that other people can actually use them. So the repurposing in week 8 is where you actually write a curating statement. Okay, where your curator's insight has to be attached to your item, and you share it with other people. Now you could tweet that if you want. That's not a lot of insight, 130 characters, but you could, or you could post it on your blog, or you could form a learning circle, which is we're required to do, and start feeding back to each other. So you must contribute to ideas in this course, because in week 8 Wendy draws a very firm distinction between bookmarking and creating a personal learning network. Unless you're actually networking, discussing and ascertaining the value of the resources you're using, you're really just bookmarking. And if you're bookmarking, you're not going to have the quid pro to actually contribute to assessment item 2. You're not going to be able to meet some of the criteria. So a little bit of a caveat, bit of pressure, bit of warning. Get into your learning circle. Who is your learning circle? It's your tree. It's people in the same tree as you, the same curriculum tree. People studying the same topics, people teaching the same groups of students. They're the people whose resources will be of interest to you, and your resources of interest to them. This week you've been asked to look at Scoop It, to create a Scoop It collection. Now, a Scoop It collection is basically just an annotated, curate list of artifacts, items of interest. Some people's Scoop It collections, for instance, are as busy as a bipolar mind. Other people's, for instance, are quite focused. It depends really on personality. And this is one of the reasons why I'm not a Scoop It fan. I don't use it. I don't use Twitter either. I don't believe in throwing random thoughts out into the universe at the spot of a drop of a thought. I actually think that, I guess I'm more of an introvert. So my Scoop It collection, if I did have one, would be very focused. I'd probably have several, each with a different focus. If I did have tweet, which I never will, it would be probably just to friends and family. But here we are. We're using these two, Twitter, and also Scoop It. We're setting up a course, and to do that, Wendy directs you to Russell Stannett, who runs a teaching education program and course online. Russell's brilliant, and I'm actually going to use him this week and present another side of his work on the flipped classroom. So a couple of little video vignettes for you to look at there online here. So what you do, you create your Scoop It account. You tweet to it, and so when you tweet, you can actually say, "Hey, just found this. It's in my Scoop It. Go have a look. I think it's good because." Remember, you've only got 130 characters, but you tweet. You'll tweet to your learning group, your learning circle, and they will be drawn to your resource like flies to dead meat, and they will pull it apart, analyse it, and give you the feedback you need, because that feedback is critical as we go forward. And again, you do the same. You become a fly, drawn to the dead meat. So you access Scoop It, Twitter, okay, and you form a learning circle. Okay, and those access details are the ones that you'll use. So you comment on insights, you re-scoop the ideas of others for your own collection, you collect, you curate. And what we do is later in the course, weeks 10, 11 and 12, we use those curated resources as the basis for a mini unit. So it's a pretty important step. So to get there, why are we doing this? Now, let's take a longer term view of why we're doing this. So I could explain my version of it, but we're going to let Russell Stannard speak. So I'm going to present a couple of videos, very short ones, 1.5 to 2 minutes each, and he's going to talk to you about your second year assessment task, how you flip the classroom, why we're doing what we're doing, why we're even using technology or talking about digital pedagogies. And it's often referred to as disrupting learning. Sometimes it's referred to as flipping the classroom, but either way, he's going to explain his take on it, which I think is a very good and very clear and concise take. Nathaniel Bott is a Year 10 student from Hobart, and he's going to talk to us about digital rich pedagogy, what it can look like, what it can achieve, and what a classroom of the 21st century is through the Think Big project that created by two of his teachers. So let's get a look. Russell Stannard.
Producing flipped classroom content. Now, despite the fact that the flipped classroom would seem to be something that was invented perhaps maybe about 10 years ago, I remember going out to America in 2009 and being involved in a flipped classroom conference. In fact, the roots of it come from something called the inverted classroom, and in the inverted classroom was a very similar idea. That is the idea of the students preparing and doing work at home so that in the classroom the teacher could spend more time doing kind of group work and pair work and more activities that process the language. So in fact it's got its roots in something called the inverted classroom. But perhaps the reason why the flipped classroom has become well known is because of the affordances of technology. What's happened in the last 15-20 years particularly, though of course technology's been around for a long time, but what's happened in the last 15-20 years as there's been a huge introduction with the advent of Web 2.0 and the possibilities of learning management systems, screen capture, putting video on the internet, etc. Lots of different ways now that technology can be incorporated into teaching and learning. So it's the combination of these two things together that have created a scenario where the flipped classroom is a possibility.
Right, so we've got Russell there talking about the flipped classroom. And what a fascinating idea that is, integrating technology by changing the way a classroom works. Now, the whole notion of the flipped classroom is to put an emphasis back on the classroom. Now, I know it sounds contradictory. We often think that perhaps the focus is technology, but technology is not the focus. The tools are not the focus. Let's have a look at what he says about assessment task 2. We're drawing some parallels here.
Focus on here a little bit is the technology, and I think this is where there's been a lot of misunderstanding. Flipping your classes does not mean that you need to learn loads of technologies, and let me try to explain why. First of all, you need a central repository. You need somewhere where all of your learning content is organized so that when the students go home, they can go to week 1 folder or week 2 folder or week 3 folder. They can find the materials, they can listen to the videos, listen to the podcasts, etc., and do the activities that you've set them. As I've said, sometimes you may even ask them to go off and find the materials. But you will certainly need a central repository. Now, there are all sorts of repositories that you could use. If you're looking for a free one, it might be something like Schoology or Edmodel. If you are working in an institution, you might have Blackboard, or you might have something like Moodle. So you're going to need a central repository where all that content is organized. But you're also going to need, of course, the content. Now, a lot of the content you're going to find. Teachers are becoming more adept at finding technologies of videos, podcasts, articles on the internet that they can make use of with their students. That's certainly happening. There will be times when you will need to make your own material. So this is the key point. Most of the time, or a lot of the time, you will find material and you will put it into your repository. Sometimes you will need to make material. Now, if we looked at a lot of flipped classroom and we looked at the material, a lot of the self-made material that's in a flipped classroom will be using screencasts. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are really two key technologies that you're going to need to flip your classroom. A repository to organize all your learning, Edmodel, Schoology, Moodle, Blackboard, and there are many other learning management systems or virtual learning environments. But you're also going to need to learn a couple of technologies, and the one that I would definitely recommend is to learn to screencast.
Now, it's interesting, we've been using screencasting all term. It's the basis. I record videos, I post it onto YouTube, and we hyperlink to it. So that's not hard to do. We know the articles, the blogs, the podcasts. This is your Scoop It. Here is where you are finding your resources, you're archiving them, you're curating them. Your repository is going to be the challenge for you here. And this goes back to the very reason why we set up Blogspot, why we set up Weebly at the start of the course, so that you actually had a repository where you can house your mini unit. Now at the moment, Scoop It is going to house them as curated artifacts, randomly connected. By the time you go through the sifting process over the next 4 weeks, where you're actually identifying, reviewing and peer reviewing these artifacts, you will then be able to sift them into a Weebly mini unit, which is the focus of assessment item 2. Let's move on. Now, another advantage of flipping the classroom, and one of the things we've struggled with this week, is the notion of converting through SAMR to higher order pedagogy. Listen to what Russell says about this.
This is a pretty common definition that you will see that's pretty good, but it's quite interesting to think that in a way this is beginning to evolve and change, and later on I will talk about this. But what we're talking about is we define the flipped classroom as an educational technique. That's a really important word, educational technique. It's not a methodology, it's a technique. It's a way of organising learning. It's a form of blended learning. That's really important. And it has two parts. The interactive group learning activities in the classroom. This is really true. What we're trying to do is make the classroom time more interactive, more group work, more pair work, more working on tasks, more using the knowledge that the students have picked up, have learned, have absorbed. And then the second part is, well, what we call the lower order thinking skills, going home, learning the basics around a particular subject so that in the class you can begin to process that language and to be able to actually, or process those ideas, whatever the topic has to be, and to actually use it and to function with it and work with it and link it to other things that you know. So there's got two parts to it. Now, one of the interesting things is that this is beginning to change. In other words, yes, the students go home, yes, they go online, they watch videos, etc., but we can actually make that part of the learning also more group work based, and we'll...
Right, it's interesting comments, isn't it? So what we're looking at here is creating interaction. Remember in weeks 5, 6 and 7, even when we talked about toolishness and foolishness, the aim of technology is to bring together interaction. Okay, we can use it at the lower end to drill and practice, to introduce, to as direct instruction, but ultimately when we want to get to higher level pedagogies, we need to focus on that interaction. And that's exactly what Russell's saying here. We can actually use technology to buy more time in the classroom to bolster interaction. And we can do that either as in our traditional teaching Vygotskian way, where we're in that ZPD throwing the furniture around with our students, or we can actually use technology too as an environment in which we do that. Okay, even in group work, pair work, a whole range of things.
We'll talk a little bit. When we look at the flipped classroom, we often talk about Bloom's taxonomy, and I must admit I'm a big fan of Bloom's taxonomy. The idea behind Bloom's taxonomy is that often when we learn something, we first of all learn the basic concepts. So let's say it was a history, we would learn the basic concepts of, say, perhaps the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire. But then later we might then begin to apply that knowledge. We might compare, for example, the fall of the Roman Empire with the fall of the British Empire, or with the fall of the Soviet Union. We might look at, see if there are any parallels between the two. We begin to actually use that knowledge and link it with other knowledge. We begin to apply and analyze it and understand it better. So we move from sort of lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking skills. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about using the flipped classroom. The students go home, they learn the basic concepts, they probably do a few quizzes or simple activities to check their basic comprehension, then they come into the classroom and then we try to activate that knowledge, we try to use it. For example, it might be in a language learning context where the students go home and they learn some basic vocabulary, perhaps they look at that vocabulary in context, perhaps they do a few exercises at home to check their basic understanding of that vocabulary, but then in the classroom we begin to process and use that vocabulary in a context and get them to actually speak or do an activity where they would practice that vocabulary. So we move from lower order thinking to higher order thinking. So
now, a really interesting point, isn't it? Even if we look at what we're doing here, here I am doing a PowerPoint of a PowerPoint where I've taken a screencast, which is essentially a PowerPoint used by someone else. I am remodifying his thoughts at the comprehension level to break them down and structure them and scaffold them and relate them and connect them to our assessment task 2. So there's remodification going on here. SAMR is active. So I'm taking what was essentially, not necessarily even a low-end technology, okay, or pedagogy. It's actually a reasonably high-end technology, but it's still a one-to-one instructional video. So we're breaking it down now, scaffolding it, and as you can see, you're all probably connecting up here already. You're starting to analyse and synthesise. You're starting to actually work out, so this is what assessment task 2 is about. I'm actually meant to move from a low-end pedagogy and adapt a SAMR model and shift through where I start to synthesize, integrate. Now, how I do that, I create Scoop It. I curate artifacts. Once I've curated artifacts, I share them from that shared pool of resources. I then start to identify which ones I'm going to use in my assessment item. So we can redesign learning with digital pedagogy. We've just done it there with that simple screencast breakdown. Listen to what Russell says about redesigning learning.
So in a way, we could argue that we're sort of looking at two theories about learning and bringing them both together into the flipped classroom, because the students are going to go home and they're going to read an article or listen to a lecture or listen to a podcast or read a blog or whatever, and they're perhaps going to just check their basic understanding. And we could almost argue that that is a very sort of behaviourist approach to learning. So, you know, read something and check you understand it and try to get it in your mind through the quizzes and through the activities that you do on your own. So it's very much sort of a behaviourist approach to learning. But then when we bring the students into the class, we're kind of being more constructivist. We're creating tasks and activities that get the students to collaborate and work together and build their knowledge and process those lower order thinking skills. So in a way, it kind of draws on two theories. One interesting thing, and this has come from my own experience of working on a few projects and a few master's degree students that have done research, is that often that part that the students do at home can actually be quite collaborative, because students might connect with each other on Skype and do an activity together, or they might use something like Google Docs to share content, or Google Sites. And in fact, at the moment, I'm on a big project at the University of Berlin where the students precisely do that. They're working remotely from each other, but they go onto Google Sites and onto Google Docs and create the documents together. So though they're working on their own and preparing for the actual lesson, they're doing that collaboratively. So that's one of the big shifts in terms of the original definition of what the flipped classroom is. So in a way, we could...
Now, we're just going to hold it there. We can see that in class we can understand and what we aspire to do with technology, and even with our own Vygotsky approaches, is we're very constructivist. If we adopt some of the principles of Betty Collis and George Siemens, we can be socio-constructivist with the technology. We can link to workplaces, groups and the audience and world at large. It's task-based, it's project-based, it's collaborative, it's authentic. Over here we're starting to see students as Boyds. Now, the term BOYD is bring your own device. At home they can do that. Mobile phones, iPhones, all of these different things. We're seeing kids with technology here that they're abandoning their school computer, and you know, which is limited. It's locked down if we're truly serious about this. It's a point raised by you know, some students in the course. They're teaching in Education Queens. They have computers, but the computers are locked down, so it's like working with one hand tied behind your back. The kids, once they get home, are Boyds. They enter into their own environments and they start to collaborate, okay, in areas where, you know, previously we would have considered them non-collaborative tools. So we're seeing a breakdown in the theories, but we can also see how the theories come together to help create a classroom in which digital pedagogies can play a really rich role. When we look at this, redefining pedagogical approaches, Russell continues to and says a little bit more.
Now, I just want to focus on 5 key points that really emerge from the points that I've made so far in terms of the way that the learning is organised. Firstly, the flipped classroom is a form of blended learning. When we're talking about the flipped classroom, we're talking about a blend. That is a combination of face-to-face teaching and using technology outside of the classroom. So it's a blend. It's a particular way of organising that blend, but it's a blend. Secondly, it means that to a degree some of the teaching stuff is being moved out of the classroom and moved to home. Now, what do I mean by teaching stuff? Well, I call the teaching stuff when the teacher is basically passing knowledge to the students. That might be the teacher standing at the front of the class and explaining something about the Roman Revolution, or in a geography lesson talking about the formation of mountains, or whatever topic you're looking at. It could be language, you could be looking at vocabulary and vocabulary explanations. That teaching stuff, try to take some of that teaching stuff out of the class, and the students can go home and do that instead. So instead of me standing at the front of the class talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, I can get the students to go home and maybe watch a video or listen to a podcast or even read an article about that. and then in the class we can perhaps do some more comparative work, more project-based work, further investigation. As I said, students could then kind of move on to sort of more group-based pair work activities where they're beginning to actually use that knowledge. So we free up some of the class time, which previously we were using for teaching, and we use it more for group-based work, project work, etc. Now, it's a technique. It's a technique. It's not an approach to every single class. It's not appropriate in every single context. It works particularly well in some contexts. I found myself using it at certain points when it's worked really well, when it seems to work really well. So it's not something that you're always going to do, and there are lots of reasons why you might not do it always. One, are the materials available for the students to do the learning at home? Two, is the concept the type of concept that's easy to transfer to the students? So some concepts are quite complex and need more support from the teacher. So it does depend to a large degree also on the context, the material, etc. Now, one of the last points I want to make, and this is really interesting and an important point, is the role of the student. The student's role sort of changes because the student now has to prepare for the lesson. So in a way, we could argue that we're going to obviously put more responsibility on the students in terms of their own learning. And a lot of people say, this ends up being a lot more work for the students. It doesn't necessarily have to be. They could go home and watch a 3 or 4 minute video about the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire, and then do a simple quiz or prepare a few slides so that they can do their own presentation in the classroom. It doesn't have to mean that there is a lot more work for the student to do at home. It's simply homework, but it's homework of a different nature. But what perhaps it is doing is encouraging the students to be more autonomous and more independent, and giving them a little bit more freedom.
Now, I'll just pause there, because when we look at Nathaniel Bott, we'll just see what student autonomy can look like. We can see what a 21st century classroom can actually achieve. But we've seen a really interesting discussion here from Russell. He's taken through the notion of incorporating technologies to actually enhance and create deeper learning pedagogies, higher order thinking skills, more time in the classroom. Again, look here, it's a technique not to be used every lesson, or very lesson. It's not to be used every lesson. And again, bear that in mind when you construct your unit, because the unit you use must lend itself to this type of pedagogy, to the pedagogical intent through digital approach. And digital affordances, Russell makes one final point about technology.
Really, the fact that technology, and technology in terms of digital technology and the possibilities of things from the introduction of Web 2.0, etc., that have really allowed for this move from what I call the inverted classroom to what we perhaps talk about now in the flipped classroom. And it's worth thinking about it, because see, what you've got now are many different resources that are available to students that we can either create as teachers, or we can access them. Now, more and more teachers are learning to access content that's been built by other people or created by other people and left on the internet. So there's podcasts and videos and screencasts and quizzes and all sorts of things. So it doesn't necessarily mean to say that the teacher has to make all this learning content, because much of it is already on the internet and available for people. And it also means that the teacher has to think very carefully about, well, what types of activities are they going to do in the classroom, because now it's going to be more around tasks and problem solving and activating that knowledge that the students have developed at home. So it requires new skills from the teacher. Teachers need to be good at finding content that they're going to share with the students for them to access at home, and in some cases they're going to need to also make content. And teachers are going to also need to think about how they devise activities in the classroom. And these are big challenges. They're not easy challenges for many teachers to take on. Really,
it's an interesting point, isn't it? Thinking about technology shifting into digital pedagogy actually is going to make us rethink our face-to-face pedagogy. Now, isn't this the sort of thing that we're thinking about with Assessment Task 2? When we come to do our unit, what weighting are we going to put on the digital tools, and what weighting, how are we going to convert, add value to those weightings in our classroom situation? Now, I know a lot of you will be delighted to hear this, because I know amongst you, you're not necessarily Luddites, but people who believe technology has a place. And I think all teachers have a right to place technology in their framework and their repertoire of practice. So we should never elevate, and this has been a theme of recent weeks, we should never elevate technology above learning. Okay, it's a false dichotomy. We should actually always ground the learning in the technology and support it through other learning events where we can. Now, the next slide I'm going to introduce Nathaniel Bott. Now, Nathaniel's a Year 10 student in Hobart. And Nathaniel actually talks to you about what happens to the classroom once it moves into a 20th century framework, but he begins by giving his opinion of what he believes current students face.
I believe the young people today are stuck in a learning experience which is boring, unengaging, a dated model that doesn't suit today's youth and doesn't necessarily prepare them for the world they're being educated for. Toffler, an American writer and futurist, believes that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn.
Now, it's an interesting notion, isn't it? We're seeing a different kind of learning framework that he talks about. So he's pretty tuned in. But he talks about collaborative learning with ICTs, and he talks about a project built in his school and amongst his learning community around the film and what he calls the franchise of the Hunger Games.
Year-olds led by Jocadia, a designer and virtual worlds facilitator from New South Wales. This group of kids, after the release of the movie, decided to recreate the world of the popular franchise, the Hunger Games. They focused less on the violence associated with the Hunger Games and more on the society behind the story. They created the landscapes and the cities, built shops and sold goods to other players, all while learning new skills and meeting new people. Project Mist, over the past 2 years, has tried to capture this learning and creativity as a school subject. One of the main difficulties we encountered was assessing students. In other subjects, you would receive a test where you would have to sit through and answer questions hopefully you had memorized before. Very stressful process. We wanted something that was more open and creative, so we asked students to document their learning in the form of videos, pictures, and text, and then submit that to us, where we post it to our own public blog, where we can share it with the world, and give students an assessment based on their creativity, their collaboration, and contribution to the community.
Wow, that's certainly opening the classroom up, isn't it? That's certainly collaborative. And certainly it's taking assessment into the mode very much where students are the producers rather than the consumers of teacher-driven assessment. Let's have a look what Nathaniel goes on to say. He talks about the new age classroom in which he's immersed.
Which leads nicely to my next example of 21st century learning. Some of you may have heard of big picture education. Big Picture focuses on personalised learning that is created by students. This is when staff at teachers at our school borrowed some of these concepts to create Think Big. Showing many of the same learning ideals, Think Big is a group of 17 students and 2 teachers working together as a class to create their own learning. We have our own room from which we study the subjects of science, English, health, and society and history. And while these subjects must be studied, we are free to explore them as we please, focusing on our passions and pathways. We participate in learning through internships and shadow days, exploring the world with someone who works in an area of interest similar to ours. Shadow days usually are a one-off, where we follow someone around, learning about their workplace and learning and making connections, which then lead to our learning through internship. Our LTI focuses on a continual internship where not only do we follow the person around, but we contribute to the workplace in a meaningful way.
So it's really interesting, isn't it? Here we have high school students doing internships, work shadowing. And notice some of the curriculum areas. Notice that mathematics wasn't one of the areas, but in fact society and history. Now this must encourage some of you to think about the application of digital pedagogy to your own curriculum areas. Finally, Nathaniel comes up with something of a conclusion.
In Think Big, we have many people exploring varying interests. For example, my desk. And behind my desk, I have a friend who has interest in video game design. Next to me is an aspiring writer. And around the room, we have interests ranging from nursing to metalwork to sports and music. Not only do we gain the concentrated learning that comes from designing it ourselves, but we also are encouraged to, in moderation, discuss our learning with others so we gain a more varied coverage of the curriculum like that of normal class. In conclusion, school is changing, and there is a need for this change. School is no longer the place all learning occurs, rather it is the place where learning begins.
And that's assessment task 2. Here we are. We have to mediate this gulf between school as it currently stands, okay, as a place of learning, to school as a place where we stimulate learning. Russell Stannard talks about crossing the boundary between out-of-school learning activities and in-school learning activities, and how the teacher is a discourse technician on the edge of that boundary, whose task it is to use technology to mediate those two places as effectively and as creatively and as painlessly as they possibly can. So where are we? What have we done so far in our journey? So when we look at assessment task 2, it's coming. It's a slow train coming, but it's coming. And can I say to you, it's started already, because it actually goes back to week 6. And I don't want to alarm you, but I know I'm only aware of 4 students in this group of 37 who are basically up to date with their material at the moment in terms of the blogs. And their Weebly. So, it's just a little bit of a message for you to find out who they are and then connect with them, because they could be part of your learning circle and they could help move you beyond the inertia that we experience from sitting down after submitting our first assessment task. So the first thing we do is draw on our general capabilities in our curriculum area. Now this was assessment task 1, and it was your own research, and you did it in week 6. And what you did is you came up with a table. And in that table, you mapped out the general capabilities, you picked out some from each strand, and then you actually identified some pedagogical application to that. Some really good examples there. Helen Anderson and Lee Sauer are well on their way with that one. Okay, they get the task, they get what's required, and they're actually throwing down examples as we go. So it's really good. If you haven't looked at their wikis already, do. I've hyperlinked to them, but I'm not going to do your work for you. You can get out there and look at the wikis yourselves. Okay, they're easily accessible. You know where to find them. Phoebe Hanau has done a fantastic extension of week 7 and 8. Now Phoebe actually has her, I'm sorry Phoebe to embarrass you, but she actually has her repertoire, her curated annotated list of artifacts up to date. So she's current with week 8 and doing very, very well. So if you haven't got started yet, go and have a look at Phoebe's Weebly and see what's possible. Go and have a look at the artifacts that she's curated and collected, and the approach that she's using, because by week 7 we were meant to have actually used the SAMR model, and we take our table in week 6, we identify a low-end pedagogy, we identify a high-end pedagogy, and then we use SAMR to talk about how we would adapt that in our course, how we would adapt that in our area of teaching. So it may be literacy, it may be reading a text or text interpretation. We may then apply that to the high end, okay, and we may, for instance, get the students to do as Russell would suggest, go home, analyse the text, come into work, okay, and assume a role, for instance, in a role play as one of the characters in the text, to actually explore the history, the role, the context of the times, the people, the place, and the motivation for the actual construction of the text itself. Or just a character, or just an author to deconstruct the text. There's a range of ways technology could help there. Phoebe's got some great stuff here on home economics and fashion. Go in and have a look. Okay, it gives you an idea of where you can be taking this. What we're doing now, we're in weeks 8 and 9. It's a joint week, it's a split week. What we're required to do is develop an understanding of the nature and value of professional and personal online learning networks, PLNs. Okay, and we need to do a culminating reflection on their purpose and value. So, how good are they? How useful are they? Are you in one? So we're using Scoop It. Okay, Phoebe uses Scoop It brilliantly. Twitter is optional. These are both technologies that I would not use. When you roll into a Scoop.it, it often connects to your existing accounts, and some of those accounts, for instance, may be Facebook or YouTube oriented. There's a public domain to that, so just be careful what you sign up for. Twitter, I don't believe running around slicing data or sluicing data. Every time you have a thought, you send it out in 130 characters. I do query about the educational value of that, but in terms of a learning network, when you come across a great resource, it's a good way to contact with people in your learning circle and let them know something's happened. Just a note here, because this is evidence-based, keep screen captures where you're exchanging with people, okay, because they're all reflections that you'll need to draw on later. So this is week 8. You scoop it, okay, and you are curating a list of resources. For that list of resources, you're actually, you will be required to do a curator's insight for the one you choose that you identify. So in week 9, you're going to narrow that list down and select one from your Scoop.it collection. And you're going to use this as the basis of your plans for assessment item 2. What is the assessment item 2? It's a mini unit. So you'll enhance your contribution to the professional to PLN by writing an extended curator's insight for this item, for the one you choose. You should capture evidence, post it, capture evidence of people interacting with you. That should be captured in week 8 and 9. What we still have to do, we come to week 10, 11 and 12. In the first step we do, step 5, expand your selected item or topic into a plan for a mini unit. So, okay, and that means bearing in mind the pedagogical aspirations of this course. So it's got to be digital. Quite simply, it's got to be a unit that lends itself to higher order digital thinking and digital processes. And the unit overview will be provided as a component of assessment too. So you do an overview. What is the unit? What are the goals? Which curriculum area is it located in? And you go through and stipulate all your outcomes, etc., etc. So you're doing a small mini unit plan. So please get hold of some in the past that you've used and follow that format. Step 6, evaluate the ICT we have explored. So there's been a range of things we've explored. Blogs, wikis, Blogspot, Weebly. Some of you have used presentation tools, Prezi. Some of you have gone beyond that and used some other licensed tools that you have access to. Evaluate. And any other tools of your choice. Okay, and work out, create a table in which you outline which ICT you're going to use, who will use it, and its learning purpose. So you may, for instance, decide that you are going to create a Weebly. In that Weebly, you may have screencast, you may have Prezi, you may have a range of presentation items that you use, presentation softwares. You then may have some collaborative mind mapping tools that you use to help on the concept or clarification phases. You may then move students into group work or pair work, where they work collaboratively in shared mind maps or concept mapping. So there's a whole range of tools you can use. That should be completed in weeks 10 to 12. And the final thing we do is we ask you to write a narrative story from the perspective of one of your students as they engage in learning through a progression of your learning tasks. Okay, what will be the story of their experience? And again, here, what you're essentially doing is putting yourself in the shoes of a learner, and you're saying, okay, here are the bells and whistles. Great. Here are the grey spots. Great. Really important to be critical. Okay, and in there you're presenting a balanced overview of what a learner might experience going through this mini unit that you have designed and developed. And again, you can see here, it's about learner awareness. What better way for a teacher to ground themselves than through the eyes of a learner? And the final thing we want to talk about here is what assessment task actually does visually. So you're building as a course progresses. So here you are in your mini unit. And there's a couple of things you may do. When you start your unit off, you may, for instance, send students out to external resources, web links. Okay, your little curated list of stuff. It may be a game that you can import into your own Weebly, where students can actually participate in the game, or they can link out to it. You may have a glossary of terms. You may be starting a unit of study. It could be criminal law. In criminal law, you may have to go through the principles of defining what a crime is. Mens rea, actus reus. You may have to look at, for instance, the Sentencing Act. There may be a whole range of and glossary of terms that you need to establish. Okay, as the student's framework widens and yours widens, you have to add information. You'll have to preview, get students to innovate, get them to post, allocate topics, get them to collaboratively research, add session highlights, add discussion which can be mined for reuse, a discussion board, give them a topic, and later on you can set an assessment item where they come back and they have to read the discussion board and identify the 3 most important issues and justify them. Building as the course progresses. Add feedback for reuse and model answers, stuff that students come up with, post them in a rogues gallery. Add who and contact lists. Add question and answer repository so that students can always come back to basic concepts. So here's something that Russell really pressed. A question and answer repository means that students always come back to the point of beginning, and then they can join the group again and off they go. And finally, problem case notes. Grey spots, areas, aspects of investigation, disagreements, lacks of consensus, all of these different things. And again, building as the course progresses, add further ideas, announcements, comments as the unit progresses. So think about how you may do this, what software or what ICTs you may use. Add examples of in-house resources or out of actual practice. Okay, so you may actually look at what students have found or developed or shared. All of these different things. So your task and assessment too is to develop a mini unit, to imagine yourself moving through that unit and engaging each of these teacher steps, teacher learner steps, as you're going through and identifying which ICTs, which pedagogies you're going to use and develop and include. Hopefully I'll talk to you this afternoon in the Zoom session.